Beat 'em ups are perfect party games. You just pick one up, check which button is punched, and you're good to go. They are easy to learn, but that's because they're shallow. This is a problem, as they get repetitive very quickly. So a modern beat 'em up has to be more complex. But how do we add depth without making the game less accessible?
So, some beat-em-ups tried emulating fighting games and added special moves with complicated inputs. Others went for character progression, like RPGs. But such solutions make the game less accessible and so less fun for newcomers. And when modernizing a beat-em-up, accessibility is something we do not want to leave behind. So, we had to find a new way to make a more complicated game really easy to pick up and play.
Controls are the key. Let's give players a lot of options, but make them immediately understand how to pull them off. Make it easy to access all the moves at any time.
This is how our analog stick-based control scheme came to life. All you need to know is that the right analog stick controls your weapon. You flick left, your character attacks left. You flick diagonally right, you cut the legs of the enemy to your right. You flick up, you uppercut an enemy, but you hold up and you follow him into the air.
One input means one attack, and we keep the animations as close to stick movements as possible. Basically, this helps you remember how to pull them off and make you feel like you're actually swinging a weapon. Additionally, you can freely mix and match any moves you want. There are no specific combos to remember.
This way, even a newcomer can come up with a dozen different combos from minute one, feel in full control at all times and have a blast right away.
One of the biggest draws of beat 'em ups is how they let you defeat crowds of enemies, like a 90s action movie hero. But to make it possible, your enemies had to be really slow and passive. This puts player in full control, which isn't very exciting. How do we reconcile those two things? Having enemies that are fun to fight alone and manageable in a crowd.
To achieve this, we need two things. First, we need to give each enemy a distinct function in a group. Some might keep away and throw projectiles, others might brush off your attacks and force you to play hit and run. They might control an area, rush you aggressively or power up others. We need to encourage players to plan ahead and to consider how enemies interact with each other.
They have to stop and think how they approach every fight.
The second thing to do is give enemies options, so they are fun to fight on their own. They need multiple ways to attack. They have to react to player actions. They must actively try to win instead of waiting to get punched in the face. If players have to actually react to what the enemies are doing, they are no longer in control.
And this is where excitement happens.
Of course, if you give enemies more options, players need more tools to keep up.
Ideally, playing defensively should be as exciting as playing offensively.
Players need to constantly make interesting, meaningful choices.
From the very beginning, beat 'em ups try to emulate a three-dimensional space using only two dimensions. This was just a hardware limitation. But somehow, most attempts to make a fully 3D beat 'em up feel clunky and less visceral. How do we avoid that?
First, we need to make sure that all combat takes place only directly to the left or to the right of the player.
We no longer have to do that, as we are not limited by 2D sprites, but this makes the action way easier to read.
Enemies never obscure the player, and it's easier to aim in two directions instead of 360.
Additionally, we help players position themselves in the third dimension. Anyone who punched one pixel in front of an enemy knows that this is something that needs to be fixed.
To do that, we snap pliers to enemies they are trying to attack.
We also keep something that makes no sense, but works really great. We make sure that characters that are closer to the screen don't appear bigger.
bigger characters start obscuring the actions, and those in the distance are harder to see.
We have to do a lot of work to break something that happens naturally in 3D, but it's worth it. For good measure, we also get rid of any perspective deformation that makes the player characters less visible.
We do all that just to make my life harder. To get clean 2D look in three-dimensional space, we had to stretch, skew, scale, deform and warp all our environments. It takes a lot of work to make something look effortless.